The U.S. President Donald Trump has defended his decision to deport some 250 alleged members of a Venezuelan gang over the weekend, as his administration faces accusations of ignoring a judge's order to turn those flights around.
He described the influx of criminal migrants to the U.S. as an invasion.
Well, this is a time of war because Biden allowed millions of people, many of them criminals, many of them at the highest level. They emptied jails out. Other nations emptied their jails into the United States. That's an invasion. And these are criminals, many, many criminals. Murderers, drug dealers at the highest level, drug lords, people from mental institutions. That's an invasion. They invaded our country. So this isn't, in that sense, this is war.
For more, Jean Lantz Reisz, a co-director of USC Immigration Clinic and associate law professor at the University of South Carolina, is joining us. Professor, firstly, let's talk about the timing and choice of the legal tool here. Why do you think the Trump administration chose to invoke the Alien Enemies Act now? And why not use more, conventional immigration laws or other legal frameworks?
I think the president is trying to avoid some of the processes that migrants who are facing deportation under U.S. law are entitled to. So for people who have been in the U.S. for longer than 2 years, generally they have a right to go in front of an immigration judge in immigration court and can also seek certain kinds of protections like asylum or protection under the Convention Against Torture. I think the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act is to bypass that and to really kind of skirt around any sort of judicial review. Although what we've seen is lawyers have filed a case in the D.C. court to challenge the use of this power to deport their clients.
Professor, why not straight to Venezuela, and why would El Salvador accept these alleged gang members who are not citizens? Is it all about the money for President Bukele?
It's, I can't speak to the motivation. I know El Salvador was paid $6 million. There's a big question here about what evidence the U.S. government has that the individuals that were transported to El Salvador are part of a terrorist group or a gang group, that they are indeed criminals, and what kind of sentence they're getting, what kind of criminal processes are being applied to them. The U.S. State Department has reported that these Salvadoran prisons have engaged in mass human rights violations, including torture and killings. So it is questionable why not remove them all the way to Venezuela, and what is being accomplished here, other than perhaps a show of unionship between two countries, El Salvador and the U.S.
Okay, and Professor, based on the White House argument that the order was invalid since the planes had already taken off before the order was entered, do you think Trump can prevail in this case?
I don't think he can, because some of the comments made regarding whether or not a plane was in the air at the time, the timeline doesn't match up. It seems that the flights were in the air at the time the judge issued the order, and that there might have been a flight that took place after the written order. But President Trump's administration has also said, even if the order was in place at the time, the order isn't valid. So you kind of have the administration saying the order wasn't in effect yet, but even if it was in effect, it shouldn't be applied in this situation. So it's an interesting argument that basically is challenging whether the court has the authority to stop the president from using this power.
Professor, based on what you said earlier, it seems like an immigrant has kind of no recourse to challenge this deportation under this law. But I wonder if there's still any possible avenues left, and is there even time for due process before they're put on a plane and shipped out, or once they're off U.S. soil? Is there really anything that the judge can do?
Well, there is precedence for when the government has wrongfully deported people to allow people to come back to the U.S. Another issue is whether or not the act is a lawful use of the Alien Enemies Act and whether it actually applies to the individual. And there are cases dating from World War II and World War I where the courts look to see if the president was properly using the power. So I think there is an avenue to challenge it in court. And the question is, can the court order the government to facilitate the return of people who were wrongfully deported under this order? The court can sanction the government, but there is a mechanism, I think, where the court can order the government to facilitate the return. But that's going to be a hard thing to enforce.
And speaking of the use of presidential power, Professor, the White House saying a judge doesn't have any authority at all over U.S. foreign policy. Now, how concerning is it that this could set a precedent, allowing Trump and his administration to disregard court orders on other matters?
So our system of governments is built on these three branches of power: the congressional, executive, and judicial branch. The Alien Enemies Act requires us to be a declared state of war, and Congress declares war, or for there to be an invasion by a foreign nation and a proclamation by the president regarding a foreign nation. So this is the president using this act against a group of people, a criminal organization, not a foreign nation. So it's questionable. This is not a lawful use of the Alien Enemies Act. And then to say that this is an act of foreign policy, the president's actions still are subject to those checks by Congress and by the judicial branch. So it is concerning that the president is stating this, because then a president could unilaterally identify any group, call them a foreign nation invading the U.S., for any people coming to the U.S., and then use this power, which is against U.S. law and U.S. Constitution.
Could this lead to more drastic immigration measures in the future, and perhaps extending beyond Venezuelan nationals in the U.S.?
It could. I don't think that this use of the Alien Enemies Act is going to be upheld by the courts. And I think there's going to be more orders barring it from happening. If a court were to allow it to happen, then any group, like I said, could be designated and subjected to removal. And this, Congress can change the immigration laws of the U.S., but it's really concerning if a president who doesn't have the power to change the laws is changing the laws in its actions by ignoring the laws or ignoring the courts. And really, if Congress wanted to give the president more power in immigration, then they could pass laws to do that. They haven't done that.
And Professor, finally, what is next for this case? You think could it end up in the Supreme Court, and then what?
I think it would end up in the Supreme Court. I think it could be placed on the Supreme Court's kind of emergency case hearings, and there would be a temporary ruling by Supreme Court judges whether or not to extend the Washington, D.C. order that stops Trump from deporting anyone under the Alien Enemies Act. And it can be litigated. There might be a separate question as to what should be done if the government defied a court order. And this is kind of new territory for the judges regarding enforcing orders against the government.
Okay, Professor Reisz, we'll have to leave it there for now. But thank you very much for your insight this morning. Jean Lantz Reisz, co-director of USC Immigration Clinic and associate law professor at the University of South Carolina.